Hey everyone, my name's Jane Mcelligott. I teach for the School of Legal Support and Services at Purdue Global, and I'd like to present uh, a bit about critical thinking and debate skills. We'll talk about what critical thinking is, what are some of the essential skills for debating, and then we'll show how to apply those skills to a real life controversial issue, for example, the death penalty. So let's take a look into what critical thinking is. So, John Dewey, a famous educator, defined critical thinking as the active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. So as you can see just from that italicized wording there, a big part of critical thinking is finding the grounds that support your arguments, doing the research, citing your sources. And that, of course, connects very strongly with the law. The whole point of the law is to, argue, say, a case in court. You always have to back that up, though, with case law. Uh, Another good definition of critical thinking is from the Foundation for Critical Thinking, which describes critical thinking as self-guided, self-disciplined thinking, which attempts to reason at the highest level of quality in a fair-minded way, which also brings in the point that not only are you doing the research and the evidence, but you're also thinking about it logically. Is your argument and maybe your conclusion, is it a fair, is it equitable, is it a strong social science approach, for example? And so people who think critically consistently attempt to live rationally. It's all about reason, reasonably and empathetically. So really having empathy, compassion for the people involved in this issue, or perhaps animals involved in the issue, depending on what the issue is that you will be applying critical thinking to or debating. So there are really three types of thinking that are involved with critical thinking. So there's first reasoning, second, making judgments and decisions after that reasoning, and then problem solving. So all three come into play when engaged in critical thinking. And so to be effective, the thinking process has to be intertwined with the content of thought, which makes sense. So if you're going to debate the death penalty, for example, you have to know what is the case law. Is the death penalty legal in particular states? What are the philosophical arguments for and against the death penalty? So you really have to take the time to first get that um, domain knowledge, the knowledge of the topic, before you can enter the debate room and argue it. And that's why debating is a very, it's a difficult skill, because it's not only about arguing and sounding good, it's about knowing what you're saying, about bringing in the evidence. So there's a lot to it behind the scenes. And this quote from Marcus Aurelius, I think, really hits it well, that the opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject, which is obviously true. An opinion by someone who doesn't know about the subject really doesn't have much weight, if any. So if students do not first learn about the subject, they'll not be able to carry out tasks of critical thinking, such as, look at the issue from multiple perspectives. So you have to be able to really know your subject in order to look at it in different ways, the pro and con approach. So now we're getting into how is this critical thinking connected to debate. So debate, of course, is a clash between two opposing sides, and each side comes in equipped with knowledge of the subject matter and attempts to persuade the opponent to change their point of view. And the way they do that, of course, is by empowering their own arguments and then looking for weaknesses and inconsistencies in the arguments put forth by their opponent. which is just like a courtroom. When the prosecutor and defense counsel, they're both trying to find weaknesses in each other's case, and they're trying to empower their own case by bringing in strong arguments and citing cases on point. As this Joseph Joubert has said, that it is better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it. So it really goes to the importance of debate. And the amazing thing about debate is that it teaches students who engage in it so many different skills. So as this list shows, students can evaluate information with a critical lens. They learn to analyze and synthesize, so kind of combine the different information, show how it works together. I like this one. Think about their own thinking, which is called metacognition. So even really analyzing the way that a student is doing their own thinking. Be open-minded, consider other perspectives, because that is important. While we go into, a lot of times we go into arguments with, of course, our own viewpoints, it is important to consider the other perspectives. It doesn't mean we have to change our minds, but it means we have to be ready to argue against those other perspectives. And maybe we will, maybe there is something in that other side, the arguments on the other side, that maybe convinces us that, hey, that's a good point. So it's okay to go into something and really kind of come out with perhaps even a different view once you've done all that research. Um, so you want to go in being unbiased, fair-minded, and recognize that that students are capable of making and defending informed choices about complex issues. I think this is an important thing about debate is it builds our confidence. If we can go in, we can argue something very strongly, we really know our stuff, that's going to build confidence and really the confidence to know that you can solve these complex issues. Also, the student will become well versed in current events. Much of debate is on current events that are always evolving. So it's always important to keep up on the law and current issues and public decision making dynamics, really. So there is a lot to be gained from debate. Um, so once we start sparking the debate, again, that's when this critical thinking comes into play. And this quote is really good in the point that it says, people who think critically embody the Socratic principle. You've heard the Socratic method in the law, where it's question after question of the student until the student comes up with their own answer. And Socrates, of course, is famous for saying the unexamined life is not worth living. They realize that many unexamined lives together result in an uncritical, unjust, and dangerous world. And also Albert Einstein said that the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. So really speaking to the importance of getting in the debate room, of arguing the points, of getting to know the subject matter so you're ready to engage in critical thinking and debate in a way that really matters. So jumping into the death penalty. Death penalty is really one of the issues that brings out those debate skills very well, because on the side against the death penalty, one has to justify it by pointing to social science evidence. The other side for the death penalty is really kind of more theoretical, an eye for an eye theory. But we'll see on the side against it, which is really the based on utilitarian theory. One has to support your arguments. So looking at this controversial debate over the death penalty is really a perfect dynamic vehicle for engaging in critical thinking. And again, it empowers students because it gets them, reading the case law, understanding the background of the death penalty. Students who enter the debate floor with preconceived notions regarding the rationale and justification for the death penalty uh, often exit the debate floor with a new perspective supported by those evidence-based science and statistics. Because we all go into a debate, maybe based on where we grew up, what our family believes, what our political party believes. There's a lot of background we have already in us, but until we can dive in and really look at the evidence, you know, that's when we start the critical thinking process. And when you think of the downfalls of the death penalty, the major problems with them, there is, of course, wrongful convictions. Institutional racism continues to go on. Socioeconomic discrimination goes on. Botched executions that result in unbearable pain for those facing execution do still happen. Um, and so all of these issues, they really raise important points for students to explore. And this way, gain a solid grasp of the societal, the legal, and the philosophical implications of the death penalty. Uh, the if we look at the constitutional background of the death penalty and what protections come into play for defendants or those convicted of a crime who may be facing the death penalty, there's of course the Fifth Amendment, the grand jury indictment that's required for a capital crime, a crime that has the death penalty. There's the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. There's the due process clause of both the Fifth Amendment that applies to the federal government, the 14th Amendment to the state, but that it's wording, that the Fifth Amendment prohibits the federal government from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And of course, here we're talking about life, that due process protects someone from losing their life without due process of law. And again, the states do the same thing in the 14th Amendment. There's also equal protection. So if the way that the death penalty is being um, applied is um, say based on if there's race discrimination or sex discrimination, that would be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, and that could also kick in. So it's important to first get to know all the constitutional provisions. Then one wants to get into the case law. So there's a whole string of cases, starting with Berman versus Georgia, which is the very first case where the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the death penalty because there really weren't any guidelines for a jury to follow when they were deciding on whether a criminal defendant should face the death penalty or not. And because there were the lack of guidelines, guardrails, it was just arbitrary and capricious, and often based on racism, the decision of whether someone dies or lives. So the U.S. Supreme Court actually struck it down, and for 4 years there were no states with a death penalty. Georgia revised its death penalty statute over the took them about 4 years and went back to court. And so Georgia, after they revised it, some of the key revisions were that they listed aggravating, mitigating factors that the jury has to consider. So they added in basically these guardrails so that jurors had something to base their decision on that was very, factual, evidence-based versus just whim. The court did uphold the Georgia death penalty statute. There were other cases. Lockett versus Ohio was an important one. The Supreme Court held that a state cannot mandate the capital punishment for certain crimes, such as murder. They have to have the jury make that decision based on the jury's, assessment of the case. You can't eliminate discretion like that. Jurors, again, apply the mitigating factors. Perhaps the person facing possible execution grew up in a home where they were just, treated terribly, faced abuse, so their childhood was very was a very horrific experience, and that could be a mitigating factor. Aggravating factor could be perhaps the way that the murder was committed was very cruel and wanton. So there, all those factors come into play in making that decision. Does this person deserve the death penalty or not? Um, Bays versus Reese was the first case, this 2008, where those a couple of defendants facing the death penalty argued that the lethal injection protocol violated the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment clause. But the court said no, it's traditional, and they upheld it. So just getting to know all these cases is very important for the debate stage. It's also important to know the philosophy behind the death penalty argument. So utilitarians, often referred to as abolitionists because they want to abolish the death penalty. So they're very, in their views, think of them as forward looking. The only justification they see for any form of punishment is to make society better by by deterring crime, thereby making society more safe. So utilitarians in deciding, what is, should something be punished? What's the best form of punishment? To make that decision, they're all about the social science evidence. So they're going to be the ones looking at the statistics, the research. Is the death penalty more of a deterrent than life in prison? If not, is the state justified to use the death penalty? The retributivists, however, they don't really get into the evidence or the statistics. They just say, they're very strict in the theory that, someone took another's life, they are going to pay with their life. It's that eye for an eye, lex talionis approach, and they're very strict on holding to that principle, that it's an appropriate, if someone kills another person, the view is that it's an appropriate response at the same level. So if they kill someone, the state kills them. So as we'll see, utilitarian side in a debate on the death penalty is going to bring in much more social science evidence. Retributivists, however, are going to bring in philosophical theories. So and we won't go through all of this in this video, but just to kind of give an overview of how one would approach a debate. If you have to bring in the statistics and the evidence as a utilitarian to support one's arguments, you want to point to the things that the important arguments, such as the death penalty is no more of a deterrent than is a sentence of life in prison. But you can't just say that, you have to back it up. And you can bring in all these statistics. The Death Penalty Information Center, for example, is a nonprofit that has excellent resources, statistics. For example, they just point out here that in the South, the southern states carry out over 80% of executions, but yet they have the highest murder rate at 6.0, so 6 murders per 100,000 people. The Northeast, though, which carries out less than 0.5% of executions, has a murder rate of almost half that. So there's a lot of ways to kind of show that, there's no evidence out there that shows the death penalty is actually deterring murder any more than life imprisonment. Also, wrongful conviction. So the death penalty does continue to carry that inherent risk of executing an innocent person. The Innocence Project is one of the amazing nonprofits that started using DNA evidence to show that people who were serving time on death row are actually innocent of the crime. And that's a really scary thought, that our government could be putting to death people who did not actually do the murder. Racial bias is continuing to be a major problem with the death penalty. And not only the race of the defendant, but the race of the victim comes into play. And they actually, through very detailed studies. They found that there's a pattern of race of victim, race of defendant discrimination in 96% of the states that have the death penalty. And there you can see these statistics, how much higher it is that the chances of being sentenced to death for an African American defendant if the victim is white. I mean, 97% higher in Louisiana. Just shocking, shocking statistics. Those are the kind of statistics that can win the day in a debate argument. Also, there's socioeconomic discrimination. Basically, a defendant who can afford their own attorney is going to be a lot better off than one with a public defender. And not to say anything bad about public defenders, but it's just they're very limited in the time they can spend on a case, on the money that they have to investigate a case. On the other hand, the prosecution has, the entire police force to investigate the case. So again, socioeconomic, the people without the money are going to have a harder time and much more likely to face the death penalty. There's another theory that's a little bit, it's not proved, but it's an interesting theory that really makes one think. The brutalization effect is this theory that if you have a state where they're carrying out execution after execution, does that spur kind of more of a violent environment and actually spur more crime? There's a lot of studies out there on it, nothing definitive, but it sure is an intriguingly strong argument. Also, the issue of the families of murder victims, we often think about that as a reason to have the death penalty. It, if we think if we in our own if we lose a loved one, we may think, well, I'd want the death penalty. But then there's a lot of evidence out there that many families who have lost loved ones actually don't want the death penalty because it's kind of this albatross that sticks with them through life. The person who has been convicted and facing execution has a whole string of appeals, which of course we don't want to take away because of that risk of wrongful conviction. But every time there's an appeal, the family is, reached out to by investigators. It's kind of this never-ending event, and it never brings closure. That's what this article, The Closure Myth, talks about, that it just makes it even way more stressful and psychologically difficult for the families of murder victims to cope. Um, and of course, the financial cost for the state of the death penalty is atrocious. I mean, all this money that you can just kind of see some of the statistics there, it's almost twice as much to have a death penalty trial versus a regular trial, just because the way it's carried out. There's a bifurcated trial. So first there's a guilt phase, then there's a sentencing phase. The person also has to be kept in a high security death row. Uh, so all that money could be used, perhaps to prevent crime in that state. And finally, Amnesty International points out that the death penalty is really a human rights violation, and there are the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, as a utilitarian, uh, bringing all these statistics in, it's going to make your debating side very, very strong. Um, Also, it's always good to bring in quotes to emphasize, for example, in this case, as a utilitarian, the injustice of the death penalty. This quote was from Justice Thurgood Marshall way back in 1990. And he said that the Supreme Court's endorsement of capital punishment was premised on the promise that capital punishment would be administered with fairness and justice. Instead, the promise has become a cruel and empty mockery. If not remedied, the scandalous state of our present system of capital punishment will cast a pall of shame over our society for years to come. And perhaps he really did foresee that pretty well. One of the this was from this quote here is from the movie Mercy with Brian Stevenson, the lawyer who handled so many death penalty cases in the South, who started a nonprofit called the Equal Justice Initiative. One of the famous quotes from that movie was, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done." A very powerful quote. And another powerful quote is this: the last words of this one defendant facing execution in Florida said, "Capital punishment is them without the capital get the punishment," which we see is sadly so true. Uh, and so that is it. So hopefully that will get you psyched for some critical thinking and death penalty. I'm sorry, and debate. And I was going to say, if you take criminal law or constitutional law or legal philosophy, you'll have the chance to get into this debate for sure. So thank you for listening. Take care.